13-4, the people of the South. Typically, when one thinks of the South before the Civil War, they think of, like, Gone with the Wind, if any of you have seen that old movie. The big plantations with the grand plantation home, um, with the slaves, things like that. But not all of the farms in the South were plantations. There were smaller farms with yeoman farmers. They didn't own slaves. They farmed small plots of land, and they actually accounted for the most white people in the South. Most of the people, the largest group of whites in the South, were yeoman farmers, not plantation owners. Um, they were most numerous in the Upper South and in the hilly regions of the Deep South. They grew crops for their own use and to sell in small quantities. They trade with other farmers and local merchants, and they live in simple homes like cottages or one-story framed houses, log cabins, things like that. Not the grand mansion that is often thought of when people think of the South. There were also another group of farmers known as tenant farmers who worked on rented lands and farmed their landlords' estates. And not everyone was fully benefiting from this cotton boom and this um, agricultural economy that existed in the South. The rural poor lived in crude cabins on pretty much wooded areas, but were stubbornly independent. They prided themselves in being self-sufficient, took care of their daily business, and wouldn't do any work that could possibly be considered slave work, because they weren't slaves. They were just poor. And then there comes the final group of Southerners, the plantation owners. Plantation owners live in comfortable homes. They're not always the mansions that we envision. Um, their goal was to earn profits. The best way to earn profits is selling cotton, and that's what they did. But selling cotton wasn't an easy business. You had certain things. You had fixed costs. Fixed costs. There was always going to cost money to feed and house their workers or the slaves, and you're going to have to maintain your equipment. But profits couldn't always be determined. The cotton price would fluctuate. Was also seasonal. You couldn't grow cotton year round. And from one market to the next, cotton would cost different amounts based on, the laws of supply and demand. If there wasn't a great demand for cotton, the price was going to be down. If there was a great demand for the cotton, then the price was going to be up. And this wasn't easy for the farmers themselves to have to deal with, because they had to deal with the actual growing of the cotton. So in order to get around this issue, they hired agents. And basically, they sold their cotton to agents from cotton exchanges in large cities like Charleston, New Orleans, Mobile, Savannah. And agents would hold on to the cotton prices until the prices rose. At that point, they would sell it. Basically, the theory of selling high. Planters don't get paid, though, until the cotton is sold. So the longer the agent has to hold on to it, the longer the planter is doing without money. And it causes a great deal of debt to the agents. And many of the agents give credit or loan to the planters for the time that they hold the cotton. But this leaves them vulnerable to this type of debt and to staying in this type of debt. And what's particularly interesting is that wealth wasn't measured by how much money you have, but really by your possessions. And this, in particular, how many slaves you have. 4% of the South's farms and plantations had 20 or more enslaved people in 1860. Most of the planters had less than 10 slaves. So we look at this information when you consider in today's money, okay, a slave costs as much as a large SUV. So say $50,000, okay, in today's money. Having 20 or more is a great deal of wealth. But again, only 4% of the South's farm had that. Most of them had less than 10, and like I said before, many had none at all. On a typical plantation, The wives were responsible for the slaves. They supervised the plantation buildings and other gardens. They kept the financial records, and they had basically a pretty lonely existence. The planters had to travel to make new deals with agents and things like that, and they were often left alone to manage the farms. But the life of a slave, as you know, was much, much worse. Their lives were full of hardship and misery. They worked long hours. They were never paid. It wasn't, an issue to think of things like raises or working longer hours to make more money or those types of things that we deal with on a daily basis now. They had no hope of freedom and no money. They were often separated from their families. So, a child could be sold off away from the parents, mothers and fathers torn apart by sale, not by choice. They were given the bare necessities in their slave cabins, but slave cabins are shared by dozens of people living in a single room. They weren't homes by the definition or standard in which we would expect or hope for human beings. As a slave, family life was very uncertain. Their marriages weren't even recognized, so there was no inclination to keep a mother and father or common law husband and wife together. Many slaves don't even get the opportunity to marry or don't bother because their families are consistently separated. So making those type of bonds and attachments left you vulnerable to so many things outside of your control. Having extended families, aunts, uncles, cousins, things like that, provided some level of stability and was an important aspect of their culture. Because at the very least, if the immediate family is torn apart, there is the support system available. Um, there was an effort to keep the African part of being an African American, that cultural piece, alive. And the slaves kind of had a unique way in which they mixed African heritage and American ways. Um, Slavery is legal in the South, but they're not allowed to trade slaves anymore after 1808. So there was no new enslaved Africans entering the United States. So almost all of the enslaved people around 1860 were actually born here in America. They were as American as anyone else. And you'll start to see some of the African culture dissipate as there are no new Africans coming in. Many of the slaves embraced the idea of Christianity. It became a religion of hope. Um, to believe that there was this better place where everyone could coexist was important to do. Um, the spiritual was a type of song that provided a way to secretly communicate with one another. This is like an African American religious folk song, and a lot of times there were messages within the spiritual that would talk about things like the Underground Railroad, ways to escape, people that had gotten away, things like that, and they were an important part of the culture of slaves. The slave codes essentially made life almost impossible for slaves. They made life more and more difficult because they basically prohibit African Americans from gathering in large groups. So there you go, eliminate the right to assemble. They prohibit leaving their master's property without a pass, so limiting yet another freedom. And they make it a crime to teach them how to read and write. Now I'm going to ask you, and you're going to turn to the members of your group, why would they make it a crime to teach them how to read and write? Okay, we've said the saying over and over again. See if you guys can figure it out. Now on the next few slides, we're going to look at many of the different jobs that were held by slaves. And please take note, very few of these seek out knowledge, because, as you should have answered on the previous slide, knowledge is power, and none of these jobs were going to be meant to empower the slaves too much. Slaves that were fortunate enough to work in the house typically did the cleaning, cooking, sewing, and laundry. Um, but they were also under thumb quite a bit. They were kept a close eye on, and um, issues of trust and things like that were very difficult for the slaves inside the house. There were some slaves that were skilled workers, and it's actually these skilled workers that will probably fare the best um, in the years following the Civil War. These skilled workers were able to be carpenters, blacksmiths, shoemakers, and weavers. But don't think because they had these jobs that are familiar jobs to us that they were being paid. They were still slaves. They were enslaved in doing these jobs. The majority of all slaves were outside. They worked in pastures. They worked as field hands. They were supervised by an overseer who would make sure they kept working. They pretty much worked from sunrise till sunset, and again, most of them were out in the fields. Often students ask me why slaves didn't rebel, why they didn't run away, why they didn't resist. All of those things happened, but the risk of doing so was very, very high, and not necessarily always to the slave who ran away or led a resistance, but to their families as well and the loved ones. But there was resistance, and it took several forms. They would have work slowdowns. They would pretend to be sick. They would set fire, break tools so work couldn't be done. So it's not that they, gladly went along with this situation. There was some resistance. But armed rebellions were very, very, very rare. Nat Turner was a man who taught himself to read and write, and he led a group on, a short violent rampage in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. At least 55 whites were killed. Rebels eventually captured Turner, and he was hanged. All of the rebels were eventually captured. Turner was hanged as a message to say that this isn't going to be accepted, and if you take part in such activities, the punishment will be swift and severe. And really, everyone gets punished for what happens with Nat Turner, although he was a brave man for doing what he did. More severe slave codes are passed because of what he did. And some slaves did manage to escape, but most were unsuccessful. Most of the ones that did were successful on the Underground Railroad, but most that tried were not successful. The Underground Railroad, as you know, was a network of safe passages to stop along the journey north. They were safe houses that were owned by whites and free African Americans. They basically followed the North Star to head north to places in the upper part of the United States and eventually on into Canada as the fugitive slave laws get worse and worse. But again, most runaways were captured and punished severely. But two that were successful that you've heard about before, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, were born into slavery, fled north, but become heroes, African American heroes for their efforts to help other enslaved people become free. So they, paid back, their good fortune and risked their freedom to help others. Although there are more cities in the North than the South, there were several large cities developing in the South as time goes on. Baltimore has a population of 212,000. New Orleans, 168,000. New Orleans is interesting because there were whites, enslaved people, and free African Americans all living in that city. Places like Charleston, Richmond, and Memphis are all growing places to live. Free African Americans. Being a free African American, yes, obviously, it's better than being a slave. But it was not easy. It wasn't like with freedom came equality or even acceptance. But many of these people, they work as barbers, carpenters, traders. They start their own churches and institutions where possible. In New Orleans, there were free African Americans that formed an opera company. But not all prospered. In fact, most were not given an equal share in both economic and political life and had things very difficult. Between 1830 and 1860, as tension was growing between the North and the South, and the South was bitterly resenting the North questioning their lifestyle. Okay? Um, the Southern states begin to pass laws to limit the rights of free African Americans as well. So this isn't any longer solely about the issue of slave versus no slave. Um, Even African Americans who were not slaves would not be allowed to move from state to state. And one of the most absurd, Arkansas orders all free African Americans to leave in 1859, just get out of the state. Because rather than have to try and determine whether or not someone was a slave or not, if you were black, you were a slave. If you were white, you were not. Anything else didn't need to be discussed. So Arkansas orders all African Americans to leave in 1859. Okay, we have now concluded your final notes for Chapter 13. You can take your 13-4 open note quiz and prepare yourself to take your Chapter 13 quiz. Congratulations. You got one down. We still have 3 more to go. Take care.